This is Happy New Year, everyone. Welcome. It is the first Wednesday of 2024, and you are watching Direct Line. Our special guest tonight is candidate for United States Congress in Maryland's 1st District, Chris Bruneau, and Chris Bruneau.
He asked for clarification, and he still messed it up.
Our hosts tonight, Mark Hunterfer and Jackie Saxton. Take it away, guys.
Thanks, Joy. I can't believe we're in 2024 already. So good news, bad news. Good news, it's going quickly. Or bad news is it went quickly last year. Good news is it's time to elect a new president. So all good things. Chris, thank you so much for joining us. And Mark, as always, thank you for hosting with me. Chris, I guess the first question that we all want to know, and is very basic, is tell us a little bit about your background and also why you decided to run for Congress.
How far you want to go back, Jackie?
You're right. It all started in the year. No, however far back you want to go.
No, Baltimore, 1961. I'm born and raised in Baltimore. Actually, my folks moved to Harford County, Maryland in 1969. They eventually moved back to Baltimore County. I'm a graduate of Delaney High School, class of 79. I actually enlisted in the Army in 1978 before I graduated. I was on active duty until 1989. During the time I was on active duty, I served in various positions. I was an infantryman at one point in time. I served in the Adjutant General Corps. I ultimately became a deep sea diver for the Army. We had a very unique job there in the Corps of Engineers, serving as a deep sea diver. That was my last job there on active duty. I left active duty in 1989. I went into the reserves. I was going to continue in the reserves until retirement, but it just wasn't working with my civilian life. Got married in 1990 to my wife, Maureen. We've been married now 33 years. I'm coming up on 34. And during that time in civilian life, I was in a new home construction at one time, selling and building new homes. And ultimately, 25 years ago, I bought a franchise where I now do fire and water restoration. That's really where I got my business experience. And it's where I started getting more involved in, not in politics, but trying to understand our government and getting involved with policy processes, studying the government, studying our Constitution. And in the last few years, what really got me on fire about running for office is what we are doing fiscally in this country. And what I've learned in business is simply this: you can't leverage a business and borrow that kind of money like the federal government does and stay in business. It's as simple as that. If I ran my business the way the government is currently running its business of leveraging itself and borrowing money year after year without any plan for repayment, I might add, we are going to be into within the next 20 years, from what I've read, there's going to be a serious fiscal crisis. So I'm stepping into this picture right now because what I don't see happening is I see the same rhetoric over and over again of, we're going to do this. Every time an election cycle comes around, it's the same thing. We're going to talk about the budget. We're going to talk about spending. We're going to talk about responsibility for this. And then nothing happens. I hear no plans coming out of there. So I've come up with specific plans. I can go into it if you want, if we have the benefit of that time, and share with it. But I will tell you this one point, and this is what really got me excited when I jumped into the fray and decided to run for office. And that was this: I found solutions within the Constitution, within the Treasury Department, within our own process and procedure, where we can establish. You hear it touted all the time that we're going to do fiscal responsibility out there. Well, there's fiscal accountability, and it can be done through to properly looking at what the Treasury Department is doing out there, what the bureaucracy is doing out there, and watching what they're spending out there. It can be brought under control. I firmly believe that, and I'm willing to take the time and the energy to go out there and do this.
So let's talk about what your proposals are. Would we increase taxes? Would we cut spending? And if so, where would we cut spending?
Wow. How much time do we have for that, Mark? That's a really big question, and I'll give you just a couple of examples. So here, let me begin. So I'm big on the Constitution. So I'm reading through the Constitution, and one of the requirements under the Constitution is that from time to time the Treasury Department is supposed to publish what they're spending out there. We're always hearing the talk about spending bills, what's being allocated by Congress so far as what they're allowing them to spend within the bureaucracy. But what we never see, and never is talked about, is what they're actually spending out there. So if you take 10 minutes and you go to the Treasury Department and download the report, they tell you exactly where it's being spent. So you can go through it. And it's actually a very simple report that you can read through. It takes very, very little, above average analytics of fiscal matters to understand it. So to my point, so I'm reading down through the Treasury report, and there's some things that jump out at me. Number one is this: anything that's less than $500,000 in an expenditure is not reported on that report. I was like, well, how many $500,000 expenditures are there out there that go unreported? So specifically, legislation to require the Treasury Department to report everything down to the penny, what's being spent out there. Number two, the method for accounting out there that the Treasury Department uses is it uses a combination of accrual and cash. And I looked that up in the generally accepted accounting practices using accrual and cash, and that is an accepted method for doing financial reporting. However, if you use that methodology for financial reporting, you're required to, at the end of the given calendar or fiscal year, depending upon what you use, you need to reconcile your debt to zero. Well, if our debt is never reconciled to zero, how can we possibly use a combination of cash and accrual as a methodology for reporting our expenditures out there? So just 2 points real quick on that is that we're going to legislation to require the Treasury Department to properly report everything that's expended out there when it comes to federal expenditures of the hard-earned tax dollars that people are being collected out there. So, and lastly, this is the hardest one of all, and that is a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. That's the only thing that's going to rein this in, is forcing the hand of Congress, who has the exclusive control over raising revenues and spending revenues out there. We need to force us all, regardless of what party, into balanced budget spending out there. We cannot continue to spend more than the revenue we take in. And that's going to result in cutting programs. And we can do that without raising taxes. So that's it in a nutshell. I've got more detailed plans out there, but let me simply say this. For everything you ask me out there, we have a plan for it, and we're getting ready to publish that on the website. We're developing it now, and we're going to be putting out there where there's links, and you can read the plans we have. This is not just rhetoric. We have plans for everything we're presenting out there, and we're making realistic plans because we're making promises that we can keep, and we're going to keep the promises we make out there. We're not going to be grandiose about it. We got specific plans, and we're going to do our utmost to make this happen.
So the biggest, I guess, threat that they've used in Congress to keep continuing to raise the debt ceiling has been, well, we don't want to shut down. We don't want to have a government shutdown. So would you support a government shutdown if it means getting this legislation passed and balancing the budget?
Let's see, Jackie. Let me see how I don't want to say yes to a government shutdown as just being arbitrary, because that is not the answer to shut down a government. That is never the solution to do some draconian quid pro quo to say you've got to shut down the government in order to do this. We shouldn't be forced into these matters. We should be taking a common sense approach to these things. Nobody should have to threaten anybody to do what's fiscally correct out there or constitutionally correct. So to shutting down the government, no, as a methodology to impress upon people to balance the budget if that's the answer to your question. So
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's just like, how do you get everyone to come to the table and do this when they're always like, well, we got to keep passing, we got to keep upping the budget so we don't shut down.
let me tell you what I'd done if I was the Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy. Everybody had to go home, right? He said, go home this weekend. Think about how we're going to resolve this, guys. So you all come back here on Tuesday, because they had a 3-day weekend when they came to the budget. And remember all that, the budget impasse and all that. And then we had the debt ceiling thing out there that was looming and all that. And he's saying, now you go this, and then you come back here, and we're going to sort this thing out. My instruction would have simply been this. This is how we're going to bring folks together. We need to stop for being party allied for a minute and simply say this. Folks, come back to Congress here and forget for a moment that you're a Republican, forget you're a Democrat, forget you this, forget you that. Come in here as Americans. What do we need to do as Americans to bring this under control? What do we need to do as a group of people to cross the aisle here and get together and come up with plans where we accept each other's beliefs out there, but we got a common goal out there. We're supposed to be responsible people out there, responsibly spending tax dollars out there. How can we work as Americans to resolve these issues versus, as my friend Boyd Rutherford says, throwing bombs back and forth across the aisle? That's not getting anything done. We need to work on mutual acceptance of each other's beliefs out there. And once we find that common ground out there, we can accept that we all have common beliefs out there where we're trying to work as Americans out there. We can start reaching across the aisle and finding goals on how we can achieve these goals out there.
So one of the observations that folks make is that so much of the budget now is essentially on autopilot, that it is made up of interest payments, certainly one category, in a growing category expenditure, and also payments like Social Security. So, and that relatively, an increasingly smaller, maybe a better way to put it, a smaller part of the budget is in the sort of areas of which we typically think of as appropriations, because so much of the money is being taken up in those other two categories. Would you cut there? And if so, how would you go about that?
The cuts, Mark, just to become straight to the point, are easily found in that Treasury report. And you go right for the things that are just clearly wastes of money. The Department of Education, $90 billion wasted out there. There's some teachers out there who would probably be opposed to that, but I can tell you within the Department of Education, there's a huge waste of money out there. If you look at the woke agenda of the current administration out there, the last report I looked at was several months ago, and looking at what they were spending out there on the woke agenda, it was nearly $18 billion that has been spent on equity and inclusion programs that aren't part of any curriculum out there. So to answer your question more specifically, Mark, what I've done is I went down through that Treasury report, and you can go through and you can find the waste and that goes on in there all day long. And just that, how many of those $500,000 that I mentioned earlier could we find out there? How about in the bills themselves that are going out there allocating the funds? So getting into another area so far as looking at fiscal responsibility and accountability, I read a piece of legislation that was put forth in the Farm Bill, and it came out. It was back in May time frame, and I actually read the bill. And just as an example of the things that are on autopilot, like you mentioned, Mark, where everything's just happening perfunctorily, I started reading some of the allocations in there, and here's an example of some of that autopilot language that's in there. To this day, they continue to allocate several $billion in there for the eradication of the boll weevil in the South. Are you familiar with the boll weevil and what it does? And it affects it's a pest that invades the larva of the cotton plants and destroys the cotton fields. Well, so I happen to have a little familiarity with this because I spent some time in the South. So I decided to do a little research on the boll weevil. Well, come to find out, the boll weevil was almost completely eradicated in 2006. But because that bill is on autopilot, every year the same allocation comes out. But because it's discretionary spending, they allocate, just to put a number out there, $1 billion for the eradication of the boll weevil. But it says in that bill, if you don't spend it on the boll weevil, you can spend it on something else. Well, take it out. Don't even put it in there. If the boll weevil is gone, get rid of the funding. All right, we just saved $1 billion. Okay, that's one. There's the boll weevil. The list goes on in that one bill. And I just hit the tip of the iceberg here. If we really take the time and sit down as a group of people and become fiscally responsible and accountable out there and really study these things, we won't hurt anybody because the boll weevil's gone, just as an example. So, because everybody says, don't cut the funding over here because it'll affect a vital program, whether it be meals program, SNAP, any other sort of social spending over there. If we went and just looked at the things that are just true waste out there, we could save billions of dollars out there and unaffect on the other programs. I'm convinced of it. So
obviously the economy, and you're hearing that a lot on the news, right? Going back to it's the economy, stupid, is a huge part of this upcoming election cycle. Yes. The other major factor being the border. So what's your take on what's going on the border? I mean, obviously we know it's a mess, but how would you deal with what's going on in the border as a member of Congress?
The border issue, it's in my opinion, they're combining several issues when we hear about it in the news and what's being put out there. They're combining immigration, political asylum, and border security all as one issue. We have immigration and naturalization policies that have been around since the early 20th century that control immigration into this country. Implementing that is not, we don't have to change anything. We just need to enforce it at the border there. But how do we enforce it at the border? Well, we got political asylum. We've always given people political asylum in this country since communism began. The Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, we've been giving people asylum in this country. The third issue is the outright invasion of our country. So there are three different issues, and I'm going to focus on the third point, which is the invasion of our country, which gets back to the Constitution. And to me, and I hate to say it's simple because nothing is really simple. It is somewhat easy, but implementing it all is very, very difficult. Under Article 4 of the Constitution is very, very simple. It was written in there that in the event a state's being invaded, that the only thing that the legislature or the governor of that state would have to do if the legislator's not in session is make application to the federal government to protect their borders. So it's simply, to me, it's a simple federal matter where those states that are being invaded from Mexico by all those people simply need to make application to the federal government, and then they would in turn federalize the National Guard troops in that state, and we'd actually have protection of the borders. That's what our armed forces were developed for. It wasn't to go out and invade other countries. The armed forces of the United States, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, the Coast Guard, they're here to protect the borders of the United States first and foremost. That's what they're here for. So if we use the powers of the Constitution, we use the tools that are available to us out there, we can mobilize onto the border and protect the borders from invasion. Instead, they're trying it through the Department of Homeland Security. And quite honestly, I don't think they have the power to do it because they don't have the ability to get down there and fortify the borders and protect the way the armed forces can. That's what the armed forces are there for. And this is not a radical idea. Mark and Jackie, you were both at the convention. The gentleman spoke about this. If you remember, he got up there. What was his name? I don't recollect his name off the top of my head. If you remember, he was a DeSantis supporter.
You talk about
Ben Carson?
No, it was early. It was the same day as Ben Carson, but he came on in the morning.
Ken Cuccinelli.
Yeah,
that's who it was. Yeah, and Ken Cuccinelli. I put it up there, and he and I actually spoke. If you remember, he mentioned, and DeSantis said this, that he would use the federal troops to protect the border out there. That's what the troops are there for. They're to protect the borders of this country. So, and I spoke with Ken actually outside the room, and he said, "You're absolutely right, Chris. That's the way to do it." Article 4 gives the power of the state, allows the states to call upon the federal government to protect their borders out there. He said the issue is, as Ken explained to me, is that people want to try to deal with the interpretation of that differently than as it states in the Constitution. And that does it really mean to send federal troops down to protect the border? Well, I say I read that over and over several times, and I think it's pretty succinct that if the legislature makes application to the federal government to protect the borders from invasion, they should be providing the protection down there. I don't think there's any ambiguity about that. So I hope that answers your question sufficiently.
Yeah, you're up, Mark.
So let's talk a little bit about one of the other issues that you've talked about, which is term limits.
Yes.
I know on your website you promote the fact that you're a supporter of term limits. You want to expand on that, and I'll do a follow-up question, I guess, after that.
Okay. So term limits it's unfortunately necessary. You would think that folks would get a little tired of this after a while and move on after a couple of terms in Congress. But unfortunately, we've got this incumbency in there. Folks have been around for decades now, and we're getting the same stuff different day. Just to be a little coy about it, simply this, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. Well, we keep on reelecting the same people over and over again, and we're getting the same result. So it's almost insane what we're doing out there. So since all these elections now are money driven, whoever can raise the most money and make the most influence out there, they're the people who are going to win the election. And that's, of course, is the biggest uphill battle of my campaign out there. But that aside for a moment. So if we can't, because this juggernaut of this political process has turned into a money driven out there, so far as running for office and getting elected, the only way I believe that this be brought to control is to simply limit congressmen, members of the House to 3 terms and senators to 2 terms out there, and then we'll refresh the blood within Congress during those periods after those times expire out there. And then it won't be money driven anymore. It won't be driven by money that could be contributed by political action committees and how they can move money around here. Because I studied the FEC filings out there and the way the monies are moved around out there. And I quite honestly, that whole thing needs to be revamped. So that's why we need term limits, because unfortunately that process, the election process, has been tainted by by the way in which these monies are raised and people are influenced to vote out there. Also, it comes to mind as I think about this. If you do term limits out there, I certainly think it would have an impact on voter integrity out there, elections, because there'd be less motivation to keep the same, less motivation for people out there to futz with elections, because look, the guy's going to be in there for either 3 terms or 2. Not a whole lot of motivation to go out there and get futz with systems out there to try to get your people in, because they're only going to be there for a short while. So that's my feeling on that one. Although,
I mean, given that level of turnover, certainly looking at states that do have term limits, there's, the elections are no less expensive in those states, because even if somebody completes a full 6 years, you got a new crop of people who are competing to get into office.
Yes. Agreed. Yeah. And so you got a new crop of people coming in there, and they're a bunch of business guys like me, or business ladies, or maybe they're just regular folks in there. And maybe for several $100,000 that they can raise locally within their district there, they can actually win the election out there. It'll actually be a fair competition amongst a bunch of regular guys like me who got some great ideas, and they got the chutzpah, and they got the drive and the motivation, and they love their country, and they want to serve the people out there, and the people in their district are excited about them, and they're excited about somebody new running for office out there. Yeah, they have a nice competition going. It's a lot of fun, we bring some new people in, just like it was the founders believed in this. They believed that the House should have been turned over like this. They believed it. Under the original Articles, on the Articles of Confederation, which preceded the Constitution out there, the people who were sent to be representatives of the states were actually sent by the states and could be recalled by the states. They weren't elected by the people. And if they didn't do a good job out there, their term got limited by the state that sent them there. So that would be a kind of a draconian measure now to revert back to something like that. But there was theoretically a term limit there if they didn't do what they wanted to do. So now we got to refresh this every 6 years at a minimum. I would say less than the 3 terms, but 6 years, that's not a whole lot of time to get this turned over. But let me tell you a plan that I have. I've not shared this with anybody, and this is it for the term limit. So this is my self-imposed term limit, and I'm going to stay with my 3 terms. And this is the plan. Should the people elect me and I serve that first term and I do a good job and they elect me for the second term, and I don't expect to be just perfunctorily elected for the second term. If I do a good job, elect me again. Now we get the second term. We're coming up to the third term. We're gonna take the third term, and what we're gonna do is we're gonna take the first year to wind down the first 4 years of business out there. Anything we got in the hopper, we're gonna get these tasks completed, this legislation completed. Any projects we have ongoing, we're gonna get completed in the first year of my third term. We're going to take the last year of my third term, and we're going to go out there and we're going to work to cultivate that person who's going to succeed me in Congress. We're going to work on succession planning out there, not to groom somebody who's going to think like me, act like me, do like me, but find the person out there who fits with the district, fits with the momentum we have out there, and will follow through and continue on with that momentum out there to implement those things, the fiscal responsibility, and work on that succession planning out there to get the next right person in there. That's our plan for the 3-year term, for the 3-year term limit.
So considerable attention has been paid in this election to foreign policy issues. What are your thoughts on both support for Ukraine and also support for Israel?
Our allies need to be supported in any way at all times. We need to utter our support. We diplomatic support if they need assistance with negotiating a peace, having discussions, peace talks, whatever the case may be. If they need surplus military equipment that we're no longer using, and we can send it to them, and it's surplus. If we then want to bring soldiers, sailors, airmen from their countries over here and train with us, and we have the ability to train them within our military installations. I observed that while I was on active duty, by the way, where foreign countries would send their soldiers, sailors, airmen over to train within our installations, and then they would take their training back and they train their troops to become better, more efficient forces out there. We could do that all day long. I support that 100% out there. What I can no longer support is the wanton sending of money overseas, just printing money and going into debt. We can't do that. We don't have the funds to do that. We're printing money that we don't have and giving it away, and we're going in debt on their behalf. That just doesn't make any business sense whatsoever. It's silly. Why are we doing that? Why are the American people paying interest on money that we gave to another country? Would you like to pay the interest on somebody's mortgage, Jackie? Or you, Mark? No, of course not. That's what we're doing. We're paying interest. And the principal, is it ever going to get paid back? I doubt it. So if we're going to borrow it, if we're going to print it, lend it to them. They got to pay it back. But we can't keep on giving away. Support them with, like I said, diplomatically. If we have surplus equipment, if we can train folks out there, we'll support them. But we can't keep on sending money overseas. It's just not. We just can't afford it anymore. We're 33. Well, it's actually $27 trillion in debt, in public debt. The rest is government debt. But we're so far in debt we can't afford that anymore. Insofar as the abysmal nature of the foreign policy out there, I can tell you this. I've been following very closely BRICS. I don't know if you follow the articles on BRICS out there. I am deeply concerned of the deterioration of the U.S. dollar as the benchmark currency of the world. It's been the benchmark currency since 1944. It's given us our position economically in the world. We've been the world economic leader out there with it being the benchmark currency. I think it's 65% a year ago 2019, 65% of all invoicing in the world was done in US dollars. It's down to 54% now. And less people are using it. And what's not there, you don't hear it addressed at all so far as foreign policy on what we're doing to address the effort by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa to de-dollarize the world out there. They're gaining momentum, and it's the biggest. It's one of the biggest. Besides our national debt, BRICS is a big threat to our national security and our economy out there, and it's not being addressed by this administration at all.
So as we come to the close of our show, is there anything else you want to plug? Events coming up? We have your website going across the bottom of the screen. And how can people find you, get in touch with you, get involved in your campaign?
cbforcongress.com, really easy one to remember. We're updating it every day. We haven't got any new dates on there yet for 2024 yet. We were just formulating that. Today we'll have more. You'll find us on Facebook. We're on Twitter or X now, and I comment in there when I can. You'll find more information on there. We've got events coming up, going to the different Patriot events out there and so forth. I'll be out and about on the campaign trail, and I'll be getting to events out there as I can. People are going to see this tonight. We're going to be doing more of this, doing more podcasts. My buddy Bernie Flowers got me involved with doing podcasts down there, so we're going to be doing more of this. So we've got big things coming up out there, and fundraising events coming up there, and that's the biggest thing. Look, folks, if you want, I'll just say it to folks out there. In order to be your congressman in the 1st Congressional District, I need to raise funds so I can print bumper stickers, signs, and get the word out there that there's a change and an opportunity for change in Maryland's 1st Congressional District to bring somebody with fresh ideas down there and start turning this around and get rid of the rhetoric.
All right. And from our end, join us tomorrow at Mama Lucia's in Olney for First Thursday. Nicolai Ambrose will be our speaker, National Committee Woman for the state party. And I think we have a couple of other speakers coming up in subsequent months, which we'll talk about next week. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we'll be back next week with another guest. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Chris, and see you tomorrow, Jackie.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Mark. Take care.